All right, now I'd like to welcome to the show Neil Chilson, Senior Research Fellow at the Center for Growth and Opportunity at Utah State University and author of the book Getting Out of Control, Emergent Leadership in a Complex World. Welcome to Free the Economy, Neil.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so your book, it's fantastic. And there's a lot of complex ideas in there that I think you managed to explain in approachable ways. So there's a lot of physics and biology and other science concepts that you go through in the process of making your argument. But let's see if we can dumb it down so that mere politics and economics people can understand it, like me. First of all, what does it mean for something to be emergent?
So emergence is a property of complex systems, and I'm going to give you a sort of circular definition, right? So, and complex systems are all emergent. The idea of emergence is that there is, you can sum it up in the sort of catchphrase, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, right? So there are interactions in a system, in a complex system that has emergent nature that are not just the direct result of any one smaller piece of the system, but is a collective result of all of them interacting with each other. And so the classic examples here are like an ant farm, an ant colony, where the units themselves are very simple. Ants are not that complicated as far as animals go, but the behaviors of the ant colony as a whole can be very complicated, including things like collecting and planning, collecting, air conditioning, relocating when necessary, really complex uses of resources. And all of those are not the result of any plan by any single ant or even a collection of the ants, but are the result of the actions of the ants all behaving according to their relatively simple instructions, which do not actually contain those types of big plans. So emergent order, the behavior of a system that is way more complex than any one element in it, and as a result, because of those individual elements acting.
And right, sort of like in environmental terms, like the entire ecosystem is sort of an emergent order in the sense that a lot of people have kind of internalized this idea that if you mess with one part of it, you could end up creating a bunch of negative consequences that aren't obvious or that aren't necessarily intended because it's a sort of complex interdependent system.
Yeah, one of the characteristics of complex systems is that a sort of what they call a sensitivity to initial conditions. So when you try to model a complex system, because you can only collect so much data about it, even the small fractions that you might be off in collecting data can end up with the model looking very different from the real world. And that's inherent in the nature of complex systems, where if you just change a little bit at the beginning, your end result could be very different. Another common phrase of this is like the idea that the butterfly effect of like a butterfly flapping its wings in Japan causes a hurricane in the Pacific, and that idea that small, even fractional differences or changes to something could have a really big outsized impact is another feature of complex systems.
Oh yeah, I guess if you looked at human beings and you say, well, we expect a baby to grow, 1% a year versus 3% a year, may not seem like a lot, but in one scenario, the baby grows to be 6 feet tall, and the other scenario, you expect it to be 20 feet tall, and then,
right,
obviously,
right.
Not. So, one thing that hit home for me, I think, in the book was the idea, that we all acknowledge there are some things that are out of our control, right? Like the weather is generally out of our control, but there's probably a lot more things that are actually out of our control or even the control of politicians or governments than we probably acknowledge and that a lot of like decision makers try to acknowledge, and that we're maybe sort of lying to ourselves by a mission that there actually are all the plans we make for these things are actually going to have the effect we expect them to. And I think about this whenever whoever the sitting president is, Trump, Biden, whoever, gets blamed for high unemployment or the economy in general is bad, whatever that means, collection of factors. and we say whoever's in charge is responsible for every bad thing that happens in the country, where obviously at a certain level we know they're not actually consciously in control of every single one of those things. um, but but obviously there are some things that we're in charge of, right? The Federal Reserve is in charge of interest rates and things like that, and Congress is in charge of the number of dollars we spend. How do we get to a point where we can kind of tell the difference between the stuff we actually are able to plan and the stuff we just have to acknowledge it's too complicated?
Well, I think it's a lot of it's about like how we approach it. There isn't an option, right? We have to make choices as individuals. We have to choose to do something. I think it's more in the attitude that we have when we do that. So yes, the Federal Reserve is going to act, right? It chooses how to change the interest rates, but it should be appropriately humble about what the actual outcomes are going to be, or the ability to predict those outcomes. And so in my book, I make a real contrast between this idea of control, which is that when you decide to do something, that it's going to have the effect that you anticipate, versus influence, which is we all have influence, and influence is very important, but it's very different than control. When I influence somebody, there's that mental model is not one of I'm pulling their strings, but it's more I am contributing to them, and I don't know exactly what the outcome will be, but I might have a big impact on their life. And so I think that's true as well. Obviously, government policies can hugely influence the world, even if the people making the decisions don't control them. And to your point, part of the reason that we blame politicians when things go bad is because they take credit when things go good, right? They say, I did that. Or they say, you didn't do that, somebody else did. The government did that, right? Like a very famous sort of phrase. And so I think that it is in our nature to sort of see those causal connections between us choosing to do something and the outcome. But complex systems advise us, both as individuals and as policymakers, to take a step back and think, have some humility about how much we actually impact the world, or how much we control it, even if we can't have quite a lot of influence often.
Well, yeah, that's interesting about the motivations we people have in public life and in politics, where if they want to pretend like they were the cause, politicians want to pretend like they were the cause of any good thing happening. And then the flip side is always that they're going to be blamed when any bad thing happens, even if realistically it wasn't actually a result of their direct interventions.
Right. Yeah.
So, in terms of, and so this is kind of goes into your background at like the Federal Trade Commission, and being an expert in how we govern technology and new innovations, and whether we react by strangling them or letting them develop. In terms of how much of the economy and society is governed by government rules versus how much is just sort of free to exist in the voluntary sphere of society, I think there's sort of an interesting tension here, because if you look at it historically, there's kind of a pessimistic way of looking at these things and an optimistic way. So my colleague Fred Smith, even though he always called himself despairing optimist, is the sort of pessimistic view of this in some ways, which is that every sort of new resource and technology that's been invented since the late 19th century has been born into a world that's heavily influenced by progressive political theory, which emphasizes a lot of like government regulation of things. And in the book, I think it's sort of what you call their high modernism, or that phrase, that the idea we're just going to design society in the right way, and so we have lots of rules. So every new thing that's sort of come into the world since then has sort of been born into a world where there's a lot of political control, rather than being able to develop organically. On the other hand, though, there's certainly been people who have said that some modern technologies like personal computers and all sorts of internet services and things have developed so fast that they have outpaced regulation in a way. And that earlier generations of technologies like railroads or air travel, had like all sorts of big bureaucracies built on top of them, that so far internet, online, computer stuff, digital stuff has managed to escape, or at least certainly could have been a lot more than we have so far.
Yeah.
Which if either of those, if you want to like wade into that typology, which do you think of those dynamics is more powerful? That new technologies are sort of born in a world that already has a lot of regulation in them, or that some technologies might be moving so fast that it moves faster than the regulators?
Uh, it's a really good question. I tend to think of this less as binary. So even spaces, I know the common contrast is born free versus born in capture, right? And I think actually it's much more of a gradient, right? And so that there are in many ways in which I think society, as government has increased in scope and size, society, there is more influence from government on these things and more constraints. And that's a sort of top-down force that is almost inherently constraining of emergent orders, both good and bad. On the other hand, at least in the US, we do have a lot of innovation and low regulatory touches on certain areas, like you said, information technologies. And the result there has been very lots of experimentation, lots of failure, and lots of success. And I think some of that, to Fred's point, and maybe this is pessimistic, some of that is just due to the inability of government to keep up with the rate of progress. And when I say government, I mean not just like the federal government, but also incumbents, et cetera, who tend to also, and society more generally, who in our habits, in our commercial patterns, and then in our legal patterns, can tend to ossify around a certain set of technologies. Disruption right now, especially in the realm of bits, not so much in the realm of atoms, but in the realm of bits, where you're talking about digital information, is happening so fast that we don't get these settled patterns that people want to defend as much. Now, we have an example of early last week, a week ago, the Biden executive order on AI, which I honestly think is an attempt at rolling back some of that for software more generally. And I think it could have much more of a captured government influence effect on what has largely been a bottom-up emergent order-driven ecosystem. So maybe it's just that with internet technology, it just hasn't been around long enough, and now government is finally catching up. I hope not, but that might be true.
Well, I think this also, goes back to what you were saying about, in emergent order, the preconditions you start with, even if they're only slightly different, can lead to a very different outcome. And certainly when it comes to technology and regulation of technology, one of the things people have pointed to, I'm going to put us all into reductive dichotomies, so you can push back again then. But you've got the U.S. system and you have the European system, sort of EU system, and a lot of people have pointed out that the EU regulators have a lot to say about tech companies and big tech companies and competition, but they don't have a lot of big tech companies of their own.
Right.
Right. Very, very few, depending on how you define big, potentially zero at the very top.
Right.
And so what does that say, one, about how you can test, one of the things, like when we have like federalism in the United States, we've got 50 states, we've got 50 state ways of doing things, and you can compare and say, oh, one state's more successful than the other. I would say that plenty of people have said that the way Europe regulates technology and the way the United States regulates technology is a similar example. Maybe our way is better because we have bigger, more successful companies.
Yeah.
But what does that say, one, about how you can sort of like judge which way is better, but also what does that say about the future? If Europe has almost no big tech companies now, what about 20 years from now?
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think at least the recent past suggests that the US has chosen properly in allowing innovation in the broad internet space, while dealing with problems as they come up under more general principles that are very focused on harms. And I think that has worked extremely well in the US. We have some other advantages as well. We have the way we do finance is quite different than Europe in many ways. And so venture capital is better. Maybe some of our educational institutions are more focused on technology, et cetera. There might be some other reasons for that divergence, but it does really seem that the regulatory environment is a big driver. And I would say there isn't a good, I mean, if you want to take it back to a complex system theory, once a system settles down into a calm state, maybe you could call that, like, that's sort of what Europe is, right? Like, they've sort of regulated to the point where they are relatively static. They don't want the economy to change too much. They don't want it to be too disruptive for workers or whatever interest groups, consumers. And you can have disruptive events in that type of environment, but and maybe you're avoiding all the downsides, but you're not going to get many upsides in that type of environment either. And I think the U.S. has better struck that balance between top-down control over the application of technology in society and the bottom-up innovators who are actually building building both the technologies and the business models that implement those technologies to bring services and products to consumers. And so I'd expect to see that divergence to continue, unless the U.S. embraces that European mental model of, hey, let's not change things too fast. Let's make sure everything's safe and secure before we do anything at all. And that type of approach is both doomed to fail for the reasons that that complex systems under control, like we were talking about earlier, have unintended consequences when you do that, but also is likely to drive innovation to other countries and other jurisdictions.
So that's interesting. That reminds me of some arguments people people I've read have made about that. The only reason why other risk-averse societies are able to have that the sort of like the EU style approach to technology regulation is because the United States is out here dealing with the disruption, because the technologies which are developed in the United States, of course, go on to be used by people all around the world, right? And so one of the arguments is that the rest of the world is sort of free riding off of the chaos embracing emergent order that the US tolerates in information technology, but also in pharmaceuticals, for example.
Yeah.
And so people say, like, oh, well,
Defense,
drug prices are so high in the United States. It's like, well, but also most of the blockbuster drugs are developed in the United States.
Right.
And so when people look at, say, like, well, there's better healthcare in Cuba because it's guaranteed healthcare, for example. It's like, well, Cuba does have a healthcare guarantee that we don't have explicitly in the United States, but one way to look at it, I've thought, is, would you rather, one, you could say, well, I would rather live in a country like Cuba that has guaranteed healthcare, but I'm like, but would you rather only be treated for the rest of your life with drugs that were developed in Cuba, Venezuela, and North Korea, or would you rather live and be treated with drugs that were developed in the United States, Switzerland, and Japan?
Right.
Those are two different things, right? And so in a way, it's possible, right, for wealthy but low risk tolerance societies to benefit from the fact that there's at least one really big risk tolerance society, the US.
Well, and it's even more direct in Europe's case, because they keep imposing enormous fines on US companies for violating the various GDPR or other various rules that they have put in place, almost as a sort of direct tax on US companies, and that goes straight into EU coffers. So it's even more direct than them just benefiting from the technologies. I think in some cases they're skimming from the profits that these companies have earned from creating transformational products. Yeah.
Now, you mentioned, of course, in the book that there's more than one way of providing goods and services, providing order, right? There's, government agencies aren't always the best situated to provide the the order we desire. There's privately ordered alternatives. Um, but to go back to sort of what we said about, politicians taking credit for, a good economy or gas prices or whatever, it's generally the political solutions that and the people that are promoting them that start out making the big aggressive promises about how, this new program will definitely solve this important shared problem. Whereas emergent style solutions, simply because they're emergent and unpredictable, don't have that same swagger, right? You can't come out and
Right.
say like, oh, well, this new AI technology will 100% cure teenagers' addiction to TikTok or whatever.
Right.
Um, so it's that, are we at a sort of like inherently unfair disadvantage if we are saying, oh, we want, market-centered emergent orders solutions instead of top-down political solutions? But if by being honest we say we can't guarantee we'll solve the problem, and the big government people basically lie and say, yes, I promise you we'll solve this problem, then isn't that a sort of like inherent problem with it? It's sort of uneven playing field.
I mean, it is. I think in some ways it's a superset. It's a even more abstract version of the problem with explaining markets, right? Like it is somewhat unintuitive that if you let people negotiate in their own interests, that the overall outcome will be better than it would be if you had somebody centrally planning. And so helping people understand the importance of local knowledge and some of those other characteristics that make it useful for to free up individuals, I think it is counterintuitive. So I think the way that you talk about it means that we should talk about that, the values of individual freedom in an ecosystem like this, rather than making the maybe more challenging argument of saying, hey, the problem is not going to be solved because big human society level problems are never solved. You make trade-offs about like how you're going to take this risk or you're going to take this benefit. And so that's more complicated to explain. People want an easy answer. And I think the answer is right, that when you compare bottom-up, emergent, localized knowledge approaches, you will get overall better outcomes in many cases than a centrally designed plan from the top. But it is harder to sell just because it's less of a product and more of a process.
Mm-hmm. Now, one interesting aspect, again, about the book that I think is really fascinating, that addresses sort of the big picture about how the world works, how the economy works, how government policy makers should do things, but also about sort of the individual and household scale, about how you can think about these same ideas in your daily life. And it reminds me of one book that was also come out in the past couple of years, called Build for Tomorrow by Jason Pfeiffer. He's an editor
Yeah.
of Entrepreneur Magazine, and he also writes about how to embrace change. His is much more centered around like personal success and career stuff, but about how to embrace change, not be scared of it, but also, really, to your more point, to kind of realize how little we control in the first place. And that sort of like, I think for a lot of people, for some people that's even scarier, but I think for other people it sort of like allows them to reset their expectations and not feel like they're on the hook to control everything in their life if they know a lot of the stuff that we worry about kind of beyond our control anyway. And so part of his message is it's ultimately futile to stave off change in your life and career. Things are always going to change anyway. It's a losing battle to try and keep things always the same, so it's better to sort of like roll with it. So I think it's interesting that there's multiple books coming out in a similar time that is making related arguments. But so I was wondering, the question really is, what has been your reaction to the kind of like career coach, motivational, like personal household part of your argument, as opposed to like the big picture society wide?
Yeah, so I get to talk less about that part of the book just because people want me to talk about policy, because that's sort of what I do professionally. And so the reaction, I think, though, has been really interesting. Jason's book is great, and I think his point is extremely true, both at the personal level and sort of at the business leadership level. And I have several examples in my book of people talking about the two. Another book you might have mentioned was a Team of Teams, where which is also similarly talks about the limits of, and sometimes explicitly in the characteristic of complex systems, the limits to what managers in, or even, generals in wartime can actually control. And I think those insights are starting to percolate, I think, increasingly as people feel more out of control because the world changes faster. And so I am hopeful that people can take some comfort. Like you said, it's not just embracing reality, but it is somewhat freeing to say, like, oh, my goal should be to do lots of little experiments and test out the results and see what I can learn about the world, and with a mindset of humility, and the idea that my life is a process. It's not a finished product at any point. And I think that I've seen more and more people sort of embracing that approach as a productive way to live in modern society.
Well, yeah, and I think this goes along with some people's theories about why the United States is a more sort of like entrepreneurial society than a lot of other ones, where in more traditional kind of like honor-bound societies, if you are seen to fail, then you are comprehensively a failure and you need to like slink away from public life forever and people won't have confidence in the future. Whereas in the United States, we have, story after story after story of an inventor or a CEO or an entrepreneur who failed 2, 3, 4 times. And then his seventh time, he like hit it big or, invented some big important thing. And there's much more societal, this is not like a public policy law and policy thing, but it's just sort of like a societal attitude thing where there's much more uh tolerance for failure and reinvention and trying again.
Yeah, totally agree. And it's part of what has made the US unique, and that culture of risk tolerance and wanting to improve your life, and what I think Deidre McCloskey would call like the bourgeois qualities. I think the US has been a great exemplifier of those. And there is some risk that as we get too comfortable and settle down and stop being that kind of society. But I do think it's really important to the continued growth and prosperity of the US that we keep that attitude of adventure and risk taking and entrepreneurship.
So I want to do something that we did in previous episodes that we haven't done in a while, and that is the magic wand experiment. So we talk about a lot of like law and policy here, and people disagree about this should this is a bad policy, this is a good policy. If you could just clear the decks and use your magic wand and say we need 3 new policy changes that are really going to like supercharge our economy and make society better and make everyone happier, what are the things you would point to and say you need to change this and this thing?
Oh man, that's such a high modernist question in some ways, right? Like, so that is sort of what high modernists would do. They think that the past has no value. Let's wipe it away and get rid of it. So I would probably be a lot more incremental than that, but I would start with moving a lot of our regulatory frameworks away from prescriptive, detailed rules and towards penalizing harms or redressing harms caused. So more the FTC consumer protection model than the FCC regulatory model. I think that is an approach that allows a lot more experimentation up front. Does it increase the risk of harm? That's not actually obvious to me, but maybe it does a little bit. But I think it allows a lot more innovation and experimentation on the front end, with especially in new technological areas. So that's not a one magic statute to fix everything. It's more of a trend. It would be like more of a trend in how we govern technology. I would wave that magic wand and say, let's look at things case by case instead of trying to predict every future harm and prevent it ahead of time.
All right, we love a humble magician. All right, Neil, thank you so much. This has been an absolutely fascinating conversation, and I think we've left our listeners with a lot to follow up with. In the meantime, where should people like seek you out online and all of your fascinating, insightful thoughts?
So the book, Getting Out of Control, is available on Amazon. You can also find excerpts from it on my website, neilchilson.com. And you can follow me on Twitter at Neil_Chilson. And I hope to see you and lots of your listeners there.
All right, excellent. Thanks again, Neil.
Thanks a lot.